Hello there, men, and welcome to the Masculinism Movement channel, a place for men to be men and talk about masculinity and men's issues. I'm your host, Brian Krall, and today I have a very special and important video for you, which you could probably tell by how dressed up I am. It is Thanksgiving, so I decided that it would be the perfect occasion to be doing a extra special important video. This video is on the topic of gynocentrism and misandry, the two biggest enemies of men. I was raised by a second wave feminist and taught about equality and women's rights growing up. That was decades ago though, back when men and women could actually even get along at all. Over the last decade or two, I've watched feminism come to dominate the social and political worlds, the world of social media, the dating world, the sex ed world, and other niche communities such as the online dating industry, the porn industry, the kink and BDSM world, and basically any social community or industry where male-female dynamics come into play. And of course, when it is sexual in nature, then it's even more present. This has made the social world at large a gynocentric culture which caters to women at the expense of men. Since the third and fourth waves of feminism have emerged, which are more about women winning the battle of the sexes than equality, there has been a growing trend of women who feel a need to emasculate men and make men feel like less of a man. This is most commonly done with the phrase we are all too familiar with of not a real man. We have all heard this phrase used to such an extent that it has become a cliche. There's no good reason for it, and they only do it in order to coerce a man to try to behave the way that they want, by attaching his sense of identity as a man to the behavior they want him to exhibit and associating his nonconformity with a breakdown of his gender identity. This is similar to gaslighting and is an incredibly toxic sociopathic thing to do to someone. But women these days seem to love emasculating men because it is not only a great form of ammunition that they can use to try to get the man to conform to their wishes, but it makes them feel powerful. This is a very dark trait, and it's ironic because it is most often done by women who have a feminist girl power attitude, and yet they are completely ignoring the fact that this is actually an extremely and extraordinarily sexist thing to say to someone. This is far beyond any form of sexism that feminism has rebelled against and claims that, men have done to women. The misogyny of the past has never attempted to break down women's sense of identity in their gender and make them feel like less of a woman. While the phrase, not a real man, is so common that it's cliche, there's no such phrase for women. You simply will not be able to produce a memory of a man saying you are not a real woman, because men do not use emotional manipulation and abuse to try to break down a woman's sense of being female just because of her non-compliance. When a man wants a woman to comply with him, he will use rational discourse and debate to attempt to bring her to realize why doing things his way is beneficial so that she can decide to do so consciously of her own free will. Trying to break down someone's sense of identity simply to manipulate them and get them to comply with you is extremely destructive to their mental health and emotional well-being and is incredibly unethical and immoral. It is narcissistic, sociopathic, and fascist. In fact, it is the type of thing that the Nazis did to the Jews during the Holocaust, in which they tried to remove their sense of ethnic identity and religious identity and their humanity and reduce them down to domesticated farm animals. But yet women do this to men and get away with it. Women treat men like domesticated pets. Women who want a man to comply will try to take away not only his free will, but his identity and sense of self-esteem and manliness. Unfortunately for men, this causes serious mental health issues, and it can make a man depressed and even suicidal. The suicide rates among men have always been higher than women, and nowadays men are being oppressed by women worse than women ever were by men. And women feel justified in doing it because of the fact that women who are not them were once oppressed, once upon a time, by men. And so they've infiltrated politics and created a gynocentric socio-political system that panders to women's every whim, even when they are misandristic or even fascist. But the high suicide rates of men has never been seen as a problem to women. Just like how soldiers dying in wars, or policemen, or firemen dying in the line of duty isn't a problem either because it's just, what their role in society is. Women like the idea of men sacrificing themselves for the greater good of society, for women and children. That is seen as the main thing men can contribute to the greater good, in fact. It's their lives, and if not that, then their livelihood. So suicide rates were only seen as an issue when the far lower suicide rates of women started to raise just a little. Just as how when men are putting themselves at risk in the military, police, fire, etc., and routinely getting injured, losing their health, or getting killed, it is seen as normal. But when women start doing it, it becomes a big deal. And feminists make a big show about how women can and are doing some of the difficult male jobs out there that, put themselves on the line, how they're risking everything, and how stunning and brave they are. But also, they then start needing special treatment to protect them because they are more valuable than the men, even though they are more vulnerable and, can't do as much either. Right? Just as how there is so much awareness and community support created for the problem of breast cancer that women have, but yet testicular and prostate cancer, which kills far more men than breast cancer does women, never gets any type of awareness or community support because women don't care that men are dying far more from something that affects them much more commonly. Just as how homelessness has always primarily affected men, and women never cared about it until recently when it started to affect women a bit more, and there started being more cases of homeless women, and then women started to see this as another social issue, finally. Things only become social issues when they affect women. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how many men are dying or impoverished or sick or, whatever it may be. Women see men as expendable and replaceable. That is because they view us without humanity, which is why they're always trying to take away our sense of self and replace it with their sense of who we ought to be or who they want us to be, which is just another common workhorse to be used and discarded when no longer useful, and then replaced with another. But a man should never be made to feel like less of a man. A man is a man, even if he doesn't pay for women, even if he doesn't have a certain penis size, even if he doesn't share the same values as a woman, and especially if he isn't willing to accept female abuse. He is still a man if he does not do what a woman wants and conform to her wishes or to the mold that the gynocentric feminist matriarchy we live in has created for men. It is not up to any woman to dictate what makes a man a man. Mother Nature already did it by giving us our chromosomes, sex hormones, and genitalia. We are all men, and if women don't like it and don't like how we are, it doesn't give them the right to try to make us feel like less of a man. They are just going to have to deal with it, because such a thing is dehumanizing, sociopathic, and abusive, and goes against the idea of equality and that we should have the same human rights and shouldn't be treated with sexism. And the only reason that a woman would even attempt to do this is because of her own inferiority complex and narcissism. These women can only feel better about themselves by making men feel worse about themselves. This is what they call female empowerment. It is just narcissism. That is what feminism has become all about. The misogyny of old was never so destructive towards women as feminism is towards men today. In fact, while feminism today is largely about emasculating men, there is no word for doing the same thing to women. Think about that. While women love emasculation and emasculating men, there is no such thing for a concept that would be the vice versa of a man doing it to a woman. Effeminating or effemination, whatever it would be, aren't real terms or concepts. Besides a woman being told that she's acting unladylike, which is nowhere near the same thing. That's not the same thing as saying you're not a real man, all right? When someone says a woman's acting unladylike, what they mean is that she's being impolite or rude, right? And it is a polite way to say that someone else is being impolite. And people these days really ought to be told when they're being impolite, because rudeness is a huge problem in society these days. And politeness is one of the old-fashioned values of society that used to really help keep everyone together with a sense of community. And the male version of that would be a man being told that he's acting ungentlemanly or he's not acting like a gentleman, right? So that's not the same thing as saying a man is a real man. And so there's no such term or concept for the trying to break down a woman's sense of gender identity or make her feel like she is not, in fact, a woman. Okay, there's no female counterpart for emasculation. It does not exist because men have never tried to make women feel like less of a woman, especially for doing so little as disagreeing with us or not conforming to our wishes or not giving us money or sex. And yet this trend of the emasculation of men has become so pervasive that it has even infiltrated communities where men are supposed to be most dominant over women and in the most hardcore of ways. For instance, it occurs in the kink and BDSM and porn communities where dominant men will be told that they are not real doms simply for not adhering to a female's feminist image of how they want a dom to be, even if that image is in fact misandristic, and it includes hypocrisy and the man not actually being able to be dominant, but having to be more submissive to the woman and catering to her in ways that she wouldn't for him, right? It's like this sort of role reversal almost, where the women are manipulating the men and allowing them to have a title of being a dom. But in the relationship's actual power dynamic, the woman really has the man by the balls. And thanks to feminism, women in the kink and BDSM community have used the concept of sexual consent and manipulated it to go from the meaning of you can't strike me without my permission or do so harder than I like, which is completely appropriate, to them saying things like, if you don't do this my way, you are not a real dom. So the feminist influences caused them to use these same sort of gender identity attack methods that, you know, women have used when they are saying you're not a real man. And as I've spoken of multiple times before in the past, women seem to want to go after the biggest, most dominant alpha male that they can find and turn him into a, you know, submissive little lapdog, basically is the term I've used before. They want to take an alpha male lone wolf and turn him into their subservient little lapdog on a short leash. And when 50 Shades of Grey came out and the kink and BDSM world became mainstream, you know, women really showed their true colors, that they love to go after the most sexually virile and dominant and aggressive alpha males. And so doms like me in the community saw a huge influx of mainstream vanilla women coming into our what we call kink culture and doing these same things with the doms, going for the most dominant men that they could get and basically seduce and manipulate and then try to change him and make him into whatever sort of cookie cutter mold they wanted to, you know, make him seem more like Christian Grey or whatever they wanted a dom to be. And if he had different sexual interests than them, they would, you know, try to seduce and manipulate him into changing. I've literally had women try to get me to do things with them that, you know, aren't a dominant type of thing or like a submissive thing. Like this girl who, after I started fucking her, like randomly one day, you know, tried to get me to let her peg me. Or, you know, like set me up with a guy friend of hers and like try to get me to, you know, go by. And so what you're seeing there is the negative influence of not just feminism, but the LGBTQ community as well. Where not only is my sense of being a dominant man under attack, right, and my gender identity as a male, but my gender identity as a cisgendered straight male. So women will literally try to infiltrate a man's psyche and his sense of sexual orientation and change it in a way that if men were doing this to women would be called out as predatory. I mean, think about it. If you were dating a feminist who told you she was a straight girl who was monogamous, and you then tried to seduce and manipulate and coerce her into having sex with you and other girls in orgies, maybe even, you know, become part of a harem, she would tell you you weren't respecting her orientation and preferences, right? And that she had already told you she wasn't into it, so it wasn't appropriate of you to even ask. And that, you know, that behavior was actually borderline predatory, right? Depending on how you worded it, it would probably more often than not be seen as predatory, because trying to manipulate a girl into doing something with you sexually that she has already told you she is not interested in is what being predatory is, all right? And what separates that from a sort of good seduction that is charming and will actually lead to actual sex and sexual intimacy and her not having regrets and accusing you of being predatory is how much are boundaries being respected or violated, right? And are you doing this in a way that is for both of you or just for you and is completely disrespecting and disregarding their preferences and wishes? And these are the types of things that get talked about when we talk about navigating consent and practicing seduction in a way that involves still gaining consent and making sure that sex is going to be not only consensual but good for both of you. But what I noticed as a sex educator and someone who was very sexually active and in the porn industry and BDSM and kink community was that these things didn't work both ways. I would do these things for women, you know, I would make sure that I was asking for consent every step of the way and only doing things that were within their preferences and boundaries and such, and making sure it's at least as good for them as it is for me, if not more. And yet they would do the exact opposite with me. They would completely disregard my preferences and even my complete orientation and gender identity and not respect my wishes, and they would just do things to me during sex that I was never asked for consent to and weren't even appropriate to be doing to a heterosexual cisgendered dominant man. And they were the types of things that if a man were doing them to a woman, they would be considered rapey. And, you know, this would be an instance where a woman would just want to, you know, stop everything and, you know, say we need to end this until you can learn to respect my rights, respect my ability to consent or say no. And there was actually multiple times where I had to do that with a woman, because she was dominating me or even hitting me, and not only didn't ask for consent first, but wouldn't stop. And whenever I tried to talk about the need for consent as a man, I was, basically ignored. And women basically get a free pass to treat men in a predatory and even rapey manner and violate consent. And yet women have this sort of hairpin trigger for calling men rapey or rapists, or screaming rape. And whenever a man so much as touches them in a way that isn't consensual, even if it's not sexual, they'll cry sexual harassment or abuse and assault. And women will have sex with men and regret it the next day and claim rape, and will accuse men of violating their consent even when they do not. And they of course had never asked the man for his consent, so it's quite ironic and paradoxical. I think all of these are ways that women are using to dominate men and coerce and control them and try to get them to conform, and if they don't, then to punish them and coerce them harder for not conforming and try to get them to be more agreeable and submissive and subordinate to them and the whole feminist ideology and gynocentric matriarchy that we are now living in. And so the ways that they are treating men are completely fascist and immoral and just so wrong. I mean, it's completely hypocritical and sexist. Women and feminists especially are guilty of the same forms of sexism that they themselves wouldn't tolerate from men, but yet they do to us, oftentimes under the guise of calling it equality or empowerment. And you'd think they would want to practice what they preach and set a good example by not being sexist if they are going to speak out against sexism and decry any sexism that is man on woman that they possibly can. Then they turn right around and treat us men as if we don't deserve any of the same human rights that they do. I remember my first encounter with this misandristic hypocrisy and double standards in the sex ed and kink community. It was just about a decade ago when I had a Facebook group called Sex Positive Polyamory, because I was a polyamorous person back then. I had just posted 2 videos there on oral sex. One for men on how to perform cunnilingus on a woman, and one for women on how to perform fellatio on a man. The one on cunnilingus had gotten 500,000 views, and the one on fellatio had gotten 6,000, even though it was older. I asked why people thought this was, and some new age feminist who called herself a sex educator said, quote, "Men need to learn to eat a woman out. Women don't need to learn how to go down on a man." Seeing the sexism already, I asked her why that was, and she started talking about how men are like sexual apes. The penis is simple, and men get hard and come very easily, and any woman can do it, and women don't need to learn how to operate a penis because it's just so simple. But on the other hand, that women are complex, delicate flowers, and their vaginas are so complicated, and men need to be taught how to use them properly. So you can imagine how I reacted to that. I told her she was being sexist against men. And she started typing in caps, telling me that she couldn't possibly be sexist against men because she teaches classes to women on how to pleasure men, and that no woman in that class has a man who isn't taken care of. And also, there's no such thing as sexism against men. It's not possible for a woman to be sexist against a man because her gender studies teacher said so. Literally, she said that. All right, I am not changing her words around. She said that her gender studies teacher in school had taught her about sexism, and she had academic knowledge that I didn't, which said that sexism is only possible when it is from man to woman and not possible from woman to man. I told her this was like reverse sexism, and she started ranting and raving with nothing but more sexist psychobabble against men, and I had to block her from the group. This is my first taste of misandry, and it was almost 10 years ago. Now, as I said, some would call it reverse sexism. It is just sexism, but you could see why some people have called it reverse sexism. But it's interesting that the messaging she was using was coming from the academic community at her university, which not only teaches 3rd or 4th wave feminism, which is really just misandry and man-hating feminist propaganda done under the guise of gender studies, even though you're not really studying masculinity, you're only studying feminism. So I don't know why it's called gender studies. And while they study and teach about sexism in these programs, they also teach there's no such thing as misandry and sexism against men. So again, that's just political propaganda. And what's being taught about men and masculinity in university gender studies programs? As I said, nothing. At least nothing that isn't emasculating to them. I mean, they'll be taught about how masculinity is so toxic. And so ironically, what they are teaching is examples of misandry. They are teaching sexism against men and then denying that it exists while they demonstrate perfect examples of it. And again, these academics stating that there's no such thing as something that there is a word for. And if it didn't exist, there wouldn't be a word for it. And so I call it political propaganda. What it also is crossing over into the realm of brainwashing, because when you try to teach people that something doesn't exist that does exist, and you try to make them think that reality is different from the way it actually is, that is brainwashing. And so these feminist universities are brainwashing the new generation to be anti-masculinity. And so we have all this evidence of misandry in the academic community, the sex ed community, the political community, and we've watched feminism attempt to basically dominate the political world and make it a gynocentric matriarchy focused only on women's rights and issues, and attempt to censor us when we speak out about our own issues because of the fact that most of them are caused by feminism, and to deny us the same rights that they say they themselves ought to have, and to wage a war on men. The fact is that sexism against men is more prevalent today than sexism against women. And feminism today is more about sexism against men than it is about fighting against sexism against women and earning them equality, since women have had equality for some time now. And sexism against women has waned so much that if that was feminism's main cause, there wouldn't be any feminism anymore, because there wouldn't be any need for it. So to keep feminism going, its cause has shifted away from equality and now entirely onto misandry. And its anti-male messaging is so mainstream that it is actually being taught in the same way as communist political propaganda and brainwashing programs in the schools in communist countries. And the universities and even public education systems in some places in America have turned into far left-wing political indoctrination camps. And so, you know, you send your kids there and they might come out having a different gender. Now, since my first encounters with misandry in the sex ed community almost a decade ago, I've seen this ideology grow more and more and spread throughout other communities as well. Now, most communities have become so gynocentric and feministic that misandry and double standards against men and other hypocrisy have become the norm. And the general attitude in the way women relate to men is with hatred. And not subtle man-hating either, but overt man-hating, in which female-on-male hate speech is not even something that can be reported to moderators. This is a paradigm in which women are always right and men are always wrong, something we've heard before as a tradition in the institution of marriage. And it's a paradigm in which even the slightest sexism towards women is not tolerated. Even a man using his own words to explain himself, which is now very misandristically called mansplaining. But sexism towards men is not only acceptable, but so common that it is overwhelming to men like me. I mean, we're just getting it from every angle. In fact, I, as a sex educator, have been told by feminists that I have no right to teach female anatomy because I am a man. And since I do not have a vagina, I have no right to speak about one. That makes no sense, because then there should be no male doctors, right? I mean, the irony is simply trying to educate myself about vaginas because I do not have one, and then pass on that education to other men who would be ignorant about them because of the fact that they don't have them. It gets me spoken to and treated cruelly by feminists, saying that what I'm saying is wrong, even though it is not incorrect. And when I would ask them which thing I said was incorrect, you know, which fact was false, they would simply repeat back to me what I said in their own words, using synonyms for the words that I used, right? So the issue is not that I've said something false or incorrect, it's that I used my own words and not theirs. That is what they call mansplaining. But people are supposed to have a right to use their own words when talking and not have other people tell them exactly what to say and how to say it, and, you know, just become a mouthpiece for someone else. That idea is fascist. I at least speak in a manner that is polite and not intended to be rude or offensive to anyone. And, you know, I was really quite politically correct because of that, right? Because I was raised to be polite and try not to offend people, especially when talking about things that are controversial or taboo, which was the types of things I talked about, right? As a sex educator, I'm teaching things that are taboo in most cultures. So I always try to be very politically correct and sensitive and all of that, and to have a very nice manner of speaking that would be easy to listen to. And it was quite wild how when I would be speaking in a way that was perfectly polite and considerate and politically correct with a woman who then reacts to something I say that she disagrees with by becoming extremely rude and offensive, right? And oftentimes beyond that, like vicious, and start viciously attacking me with her vitriolic language. You know, and men are taught to be polite and nice when talking to women and to cater to those women, right? And just try to be very sensitive and considerate, right? Yet women being rude or offensive or even vicious towards men has become very common and commonly accepted because of feminism. Women often speak to men in vicious and vitriolic ways and will attempt to attack him and break him down and be verbally abusive and malicious, even when that man has done literally nothing to deserve it. Even though feminists have said that words can be a form of violence because someone can be verbally abusive and that verbal abuse can be traumatizing, so it is actually a legitimate form of assault and violence. And so men should not talk to women in just any kind of way. You know, they have to be nice, right? But the same feminist rule doesn't apply to women talking to men. Women will and often do speak to men in ways that feminists would call verbal assault if the genders were reversed. But when a woman does it to a man, it's perfectly fine. The same thing goes with sexist language. Women use extremely sexist language towards men and don't even see it as being sexist. However, women also can accuse men of being sexist towards them anytime they like, and their definition for it has become so broad that it is almost all-encompassing. Like anything a man says could potentially be construed as sexist. Sexism has become a card women want to play whenever they wish to justify starting a fight with a man and engaging with that kind of vicious, vitriolic verbal abuse towards him. Sexist language from men used to be exemplified by a man saying that women weren't men's equals, that women belonged in the kitchen, right? Things like that that were just a little belittling, okay? And not necessarily an attack on the woman's identity, though, or her gender, or her self-esteem, or anything like that. It wasn't really that malicious. He wasn't trying to emotionally traumatize her or anything like that, like women do with men in the way they treat them. But yet nowadays, a man can be called sexist for literally just taking up too much space on a subway. Right? And then find women turning and screaming words at him that if a man were to say it to a woman, it would be called hate speech. But she can scream this hateful language at him because she's a woman and he's a man, right? And he's taking up too much space on the train. Oh, how sexist and, you know, what a misogynistic pig this man is for taking up more space. This shows that after feminists fought for equality, there's no women out there who actually really practice it or want it. What they wanted and have gotten is to be placed on a pedestal. And they believe men's place is groveling at their feet, worshiping them, while they berate them from their ivory towers with the most atrocious degradation you can imagine. Could you imagine what would happen if men did this to women? But men aren't allowed to talk down to women, even in the slightest anymore, or else they'll face evil social repercussions from them. In fact, men cannot use their voices in many of the ways that women can. Under the feminist ideology, men don't have the right to free speech. I cannot even put out politically correct scientific information on the female sex organ without feminists telling me that I have no right to talk about their genitals as a man and be accused of mansplaining. And they will tell me that I'm wrong, and in the most offensive and oppressive way they possibly can, even when I've not actually said anything that is scientifically inaccurate and incorrect. Feminists and women in general seem to enjoy censoring us men and telling us what we can and cannot say. But they don't seem to care about being politically correct and non-sexist in their own language when they talk about men, because they know that they can get away with it, as no authorities are going to moderate them and tell them not to use their voices how they want to. And that is another one of the double standards and hypocrisy that I'm here to point out in the masculinism movement. For now, after 10 years of suffering the sexist abuses I have suffered as a sex educator in that world, and basically having my career get tanked by fourth wave feminism, as well as the other abuses I've had to suffer from the misandric, gynocentric communities of the world, you know, like the dating world and the political and business world. Now, I finally decided to speak out against this misandry and the hypocritical double standards that women and feminism has against men. So if you'd like to learn more about misandry and how this modern anti-male sexism affects us men, you can read all about it in an expose I wrote that this was actually just the introduction to by clicking the link below. And also be sure to stay tuned for the next videos coming out, which will be a series exposing the matriarchy that we live in. And that concludes this talk. Thank you for listening. Be sure to share your own thoughts and opinions on the sexism against men by commenting below. And if you like this video, be sure to hit the like button and share these messages with everyone by sharing the video on social media, talking about these things as well. And lastly, check out the links in the description below for other resources for your masculine personal development and living the life you want to as an independent man. Stay tuned for the next video coming out soon, which will be on the female invasion. And make sure you subscribe so you'll be notified when that is. And until then, take care of yourselves, men, because no woman out there is going to.